Welcome to our lecture on Sociology of Media. Mass media refer to the print and electronic means of communication that carry messages to widespread audiences. Mass media are a product of what are called the cultural industries, or sometimes the creative industries. These are industries that combine the creation, production, and distribution of goods and services that are cultural in nature, everything from movies to podcasts to publishing, and usually protected by intellectual property rights. However, despite being called the creative industries, cultural industries aren't necessarily organized to generate creativity. Usually, instead of constantly developing new ideas, most large TV and movie studios, as well as publishing houses and other purveyors of cultural product, function more like assembly lines, reusing old storylines and stock characters because they've been successful in the past.
That's because content is expensive to produce. A high production value TV show, Stranger Things, The Mandalorian, any of the Marvel properties, can cost over $20 million per episode to make. The average Hollywood film, between $100 and $150 million to produce and market. So producers aren't always looking to push the envelope with fresh new ideas, because if a show or movie flops, they walk away with nothing. Instead, they often opt to be more careful. This tendency was termed the logic of safety by media researcher Todd Gitlin. The logic of safety describes the tendency of producers to repackage the same ideas, themes, and formulas in order to minimize risk and maximize profit. This poster for the 2007 action film Shoot 'em Up gives us some idea of how that might work. It carefully highlights all the things that tend to draw audiences: guns, violence, sexy half-naked women, slow motion jump scenes, stark urban architecture, and long black trench coats that seem straight out of The Matrix or the Inception series. The logic of safety promises that if something is popular in one film and makes that film a lot of money, pretty much every film after will copy it.
One thing that helps to explain the prevalence of stereotypes in the media is the logic of safety. A stereotype is an unreliable generalization about all members of a group that does not recognize individual differences between members of that group. Stereotypes may persist in media content because stock or stereotyped characters that were popular with audiences in the past tend to get recycled. This can create a frustrating conundrum for minority actors, like these shown in this meme, of Latino actors dressed as various stereotyped characters and holding a sign that says, "We'll stereotype for food." One of the most important things to remember when analyzing media critically is this: mass media mostly exists to sell stuff to us. We tune in for the entertainment or the news content, but that isn't really what these outlets are for. Mass media, at least the kind that is seemingly free, that you don't need to pay to access, are largely funded by advertising, and the entertainment or news content is like the sugar coating to get us to swallow the pill, i.e., sit through the commercials. Because media content is changing, and media forms and outlets are also changing and evolving rapidly, advertisers have had to adapt to keep up, making it so you have to minimize several pop-up ads before you can get to the website you wanted to read, or embedding advertising into shows or movies through paid product placement, making sure the characters are drinking branded soft drinks or alcohol, making certain all labels are prominently displayed. The central role of advertising in funding so much of the media we consume tends to foster a phenomenon that French sociologist Jean Baudrillard called hyperconsumerism, or the practice of buying more than we need, want, or can realistically afford. People have certain basic needs: food, shelter, medical care, clothing, which is a kind of shelter, and advertisers compete to fill these needs, fighting over whose breakfast cereal or whose sneakers gets the biggest market share. But often the real key to get people to spend money on your product is in creating some new need, convincing people they have it, and then presenting them with your product, the only one qualified to fill it. Often this is done by preying on people's insecurities, and women can be a favorite target. In the United States, many light-skinned Caucasians seek a tanned look, but in many other parts of the world, where the majority of the population is darker skinned, the emphasis is often on skin bleaching or whitening. Skin bleaches and lighteners are a $10 billion a year global industry, and they can be pretty caustic, burning or irritating the skin. Most are meant to be applied to the face and hands, but some, like this one, promise to make your armpits more beautiful by making them lighter. It's hard to imagine a lot of women were walking around in Thailand, Ecuador, or Bangladesh worrying about whether their armpits were the right color, until some clever advertiser introduced the idea that they should be, and instantly provided a product that existed just to fill that particular and newly created need. Media in theory. Let's go back to the theoretical perspectives in sociology for a moment. Adherents to the interactionist perspective stress that people in social situations are constantly performing, like actors on a stage, except the role they're playing is themselves, or more specifically, one of a dozen different selves. The person we are for our friends, for strangers, for a new date, for an employer, and so on. We use symbol systems, our verbal and body language, our clothes, etc., as props to project the identities we have or want to have. And that is where media, specifically advertising, comes in. In a consumerist society like ours, advertising has taught us that what we buy is an important expression of who we are. 200 years ago, a person might have only had one pair of shoes, and their purpose was to protect their feet. Now a person may have dozens, and each one is supposed to project a different image for a different role, persona, or mood. Moreover, we are told that a person who wears Nikes is fundamentally different than a person who wears Vans or Chuck Taylors, and that our choice of brand or style is a way of determining which of those people we want to be. This is one of the ways that an interactionist would understand the role of media. He or she would look at how ads appeal to our need to both be seen as individuals and to belong to groups of other people by telling us we can buy our way into having both. He would also look at how people express identities through other media choices. The kind of music we listen to, for example, is a particular important marker of all kinds of things for people, especially teenagers and young adults, who often form friendship groups or even decide who they want to date based on whether they like the same bands or groups. Because we want to project positive images of ourselves, and because our society is one which values wealth, often treating people who are rich as fundamentally better, smarter, or more worthwhile than people who aren't, many of us purchase products with the express purpose of looking rich and successful. This creates a phenomenon sociologist Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption, the spending of money or display of wealth in order to achieve social status. It's why people spend thousands of dollars on Rolex watches when a $10 quartz crystal watch from Walmart keeps time just as well, or even more accurately, than an expensive mechanical one. The functionalist perspective, in turn, looks at how social institutions contribute to societal function and stability. Analyzing media, a functionalist would ask the question, what does this thing, what does media, do for society? How does it serve our communities or ensure social stability? Media has both important manifest functions, open or stated functions, and important latent functions, unconscious or unstated functions. Its manifest functions are obvious, to entertain and inform. Its latent functions are broader. It helps to socialize new members and enforces basic social norms. Media aimed at children show this in particular, frequently mixing in stories and songs with lessons about colors, letters, numbers, and expected behavior. Look both ways while crossing the street. Wear your seatbelt. Say please and thank you. Anyone who grew up watching children's cartoons is probably familiar with PSAs on drug use, like this 1991 paperback book in which the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles rapped about just saying no. Finally, media promote consumption. This could be seen either as its manifest function or its latent function, depending on your perspective. But in a capitalist society, this is a big one. Consumption is a key means by which wealth is generated and is considered a measure of overall economic strength. Again, the real purpose of media is delivering you to advertisers. That's how it's funded. The role of media in socializing us is the root of what media analysts Gerbner and Gross call cultivation theory. Cultivation theory argues that over time, media exposure will subtly cultivate or shape our perceptions of reality. This cultivation can have an impact even on light consumers of media, because the impact on heavy consumers has an impact on the culture as a whole. Storytelling is a fundamental part of human culture. We socialize and teach children through stories. Even as adults, one of the most effective ways to get a message across is to make a story out of it. Any expert on public speaking knows this. If you stand in front of a room full of people and say, "Let me tell you a story," the audience's body language immediately changes. They look up, shift forward, put down their pens and their smartphones. You have their attention. We love stories. They're how we learn. As George Gerbner said, the person who tells the stories in a culture has tremendous power to shape the culture's behavior. 100 years ago, our primary storytellers were our parents and other older people in our community, our clergy, and our teachers. Now, it's a handful of global media conglomerates who are primarily driven by a motivation to make money. Human beings are still complex creatures with intelligent minds and free will, so no one is arguing that we immediately go out and do whatever our TV tells us to. Rather, Gerbner and Gross argue, media's power comes from its ability to frame normality and reality and to define common sense. Any individual experiences only a small segment of the world directly, but most of us think we know what life is like living in a ghetto or in a prison, or what it's like to work in a hospital ER or a top law firm. In reality, we've only ever experienced those places through TV and movies, of course. Media also subtly shape our ideas about other things. They tell us what beauty is, what success looks like, what true love is, and we often subconsciously find ourselves measuring our own selves and our own experiences against those ideals. For generations, researchers have been interested in the role that media violence plays in shaping our behavior. American media is pretty violent, and it's been getting more so over time. Violence in films has more than doubled since 1950, and gun violence in PG-13 rated films has tripled since 1985, according to the American Association of Pediatrics. Children who play first-person shooter games like Halo or Fallout may commit thousands of digital murders every year. Does exposure to violence make us more likely to commit violence? Most of us would assume yes, but surprisingly, the evidence on this is mixed. Experiments show some increase in aggressive behavior among children immediately after the viewing of violent media or playing a violent video game, but the evidence of a long-lasting effect is weaker. However, one way that violent media do seem to affect us is by framing our idea about what the real world is like. Research on the role of violent media suggests that the more violent media we consume, the more we tend to fall prey to something called mean world syndrome. Our actual odds of becoming a victim of a violent crime are only about 1% each year. But the more TV we watch, the more likely we are to drastically overstate those odds. Research by Nabi and Sullivan in 2001 found that the volume of television viewing directly correlated both to how much crime subjects believed was out there and to their self-reported protective measures, things like locking their doors when home, not leaving windows open, carrying pepper spray or a weapon, etc. One thing that helps to explain mean world syndrome is that news media, especially local news, is heavily focused on crime. In an average broadcast, anywhere between 30 to 50% of airtime will be devoted to crime stories. Sometimes, when news covers some new social problem or crime trend, it goes overboard, and the coverage turns into what we might call a moral panic. Moral panic describes a feeling of fear spread among a large number of people that some new deviant or criminal group or behavior threatens the well-being of society. The threat may be real, or it might be an urban legend, basically a made up story, but generally the fear or attention it generates is highly overblown. When you were growing up, you may have heard stories about children who died from eating poisoned Halloween candy, or candy or apples with razor blades hidden in them. Maybe this impacted your experience of Halloween. Some American children talk about not being allowed to go trick or treating at all, or having their parents go through their candy before they were allowed to eat it, pulling little candy bars apart, looking for hypodermic needles. Stories about children who had died or been maimed from being given poisoned or otherwise weaponized Halloween candy while trick or treating began to gain popularity in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. Supposedly, there was this new sick and twisted crime on the rise, where random sociopaths all over the country were killing little kids by giving out poisoned treats to trick or treaters. News media covered it extensively, and some towns even shut down trick or treating as a result. Did it ever happen? Was it a trend? How many kids actually died from eating poisoned Halloween candy? To our knowledge, there was only one, and he didn't get it from a stranger while trick or treating. On Halloween in 1974, an 8-year-old boy named Timothy O'Brien died. His candy had indeed been poisoned, but it hadn't been by a stranger. A few days prior, his own father, a man named Ronald Clark O'Brien, had taken out a $40,000 life insurance policy on Timothy and his sister Elizabeth as a way to get out of debt. The only way to collect the money required that at least one of his children die, so the elder O'Brien laced some Pixie Stix candy with cyanide and cajoled his son into eating one before bed. When the death was investigated, he tried to claim the boy had gotten the poison candy from trick-or-treating at another house. Timothy O'Brien's story is a terrible one, but the idea that thousands or more of people were actively trying to prey on little kids by giving them poison candy, which spawned a moral panic and completely changed the geography of Halloween for generations of American children, that was simply never true. Another way that news media coverage can become dysfunctional and misinform people instead of informing them comes in the form of fake or hoax news. This is defined as false information presented to look like a credible, albeit very sensationalistic news story. The intent of fake news can be varied. It might be to produce so-called clickbait, to take viewers to a site where they would be exposed to ads or malware, for example. It could be to play a hoax or just make a joke. Or in some cases, the intent is to spread deliberate misinformation aimed at harming a person or organization.
One popular type of content that can be very misleading are conspiracy theories. These blame illegal or harmful acts on the supposed secret plots of governments or other powerful groups. Conspiracy theories have always been around, and sometimes they're facilitated by people who have a vested interest in misleading the public. In the 1800s and before, monarchs in places like Europe and the Russian Empire would sometimes spread rumors that Jewish people or other minority groups were responsible for things like plagues or economic depressions or even bad weather. The local populace would blame that minority community and attack them with mob violence, but they wouldn't blame the king. Conspiracy theories appear to be getting more common and problematic because social media and the internet really facilitate their spread. It used to be that you'd hear about them by word of mouth, but now you can find dozens of professional-looking websites full of so-called data, all fake, but you might not know that seem to provide proof that the world is really flat instead of round, and, quote, the government has been lying to you all this time. Some conspiracy theories are just silly, but some are actively harmful, like this one, which followed the horrific Sandy Hook school shooting in 2012, in which a young man shot and killed his mother, then drove to the school where she worked and murdered 20 6- and 7-year-old children and 6 staff members. Following that tragedy, a media personality named Alex Jones began using his platform, InfoWars, to promote a conspiracy theory that the Sandy Hook massacre had never really happened, that the government had staged it to justify taking away people's guns. Jones and some of his guests began arguing that there was no shooting, and the parents of all those dead kids had never had kids at all. They were all just crisis actors on the federal payroll. Adherents to this theory, so-called Sandy Hook truthers, began doxing the victims' families, posting their addresses and other personal information on online discussion boards. Then people began showing up at the houses of victims' families or following them in public, harassing and threatening them. One grieving father was told by a member of the conspiracy group, according to the New York Times in 2019, that the harassment would only stop if he exhumed the body of his dead son so that they could verify he was telling the truth. Instead, some of the families and first responders turned around and sued Jones for defamation. Those suits were successful, at least at the time of this recording. Courts in both Connecticut and Texas awarded the plaintiffs over $1.4 billion in combined damages. Jones appealed to the Supreme Court, but in October of 2025, the court rejected the appeal. Conspiracy theories run the political spectrum. Following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, many critics of George W. Bush promoted a theory that the 9/11 attacks had somehow been an inside job. And conspiracy theories during COVID-19 caused people in many communities to refuse vaccination or even to distrust health officials' warnings that the virus was real and dangerous. And yes, every once in a while, a great while, something that starts out sounding like a conspiracy theory ends up being proven. The Watergate conspiracy during the Nixon administration ended up being true. But most conspiracy theories are both impossible to verify and also impossible to disprove. No matter what evidence you put in front of a conspiracy theorist to show them they're wrong, they'll say, well, but that's what they want you to think. In the past, we got all our news from pretty much the same places, the same 3 channels, the same handful of newspapers. But now, there's a proliferation of news options, and we have more choices. Theoretically, that should be a good thing. With 100 different news outlets, we should all be 100 times more informed. Except what we're seeing is the opposite instead. An echo chamber effect basically refers to a group process where ideas, information, and beliefs are amplified through repetition, while different or competing views are shut out or censored. The internet has exaggerated this through something political activist Eli Pariser calls the filter bubble. Every time you search on your phone or computer, that data is tracked and feeds into an algorithm that might determine what you see the next time you type in a search term. Simple experiments are done in which a room full of people are all asked to type in a simple term on their smartphones, and everyone gets a different set of results. Type in British Petroleum, for example, and the guy who visits environmentalist sites gets a list of links to news about oil spills. Another gets job listings. A third, who recently researched investing, gets stock tips. The same with politics. You can find new information still if you actively seek it out, but you have to be willing to seek it out. In an interview with David Letterman, President Barack Obama argued that this might be one of the biggest threats to democracy that he believes there is now. The fact that Americans no longer share a common news source, that we tend to disappear in our own algorithm-driven filter bubbles. This may help to explain why we've seen such a wave of conspiracy theories in politics in recent years. A belief that some shadowy, covert, but influential organization or group of people is responsible for a circumstance or an event. If you start researching a particular conspiracy theory, the internet might just keep feeding you more and more information about it, until the truth and veracity of that theory seems self-evident. Let's talk about other ways that social media can impact us, both negatively and positively. What kind of social media sites do you use? And how does spending time on social media make you feel? Good? Does it ever make you feel bad? What about accuracy? Do people generally present their lives accurately and honestly on social media? Do you? Most of us aren't entirely honest in the way we present ourselves on social media, or maybe anywhere. A member of the interactionist perspective would argue that most people fib a little bit in social interactions, in ways we might not even be aware of. We smile politely when we're actually sad, say we're doing great when we're not, act more confident than we really are. Sociologist Irving Goffman called this face work, describing the work we do to present a positive image of ourselves to others in daily interaction. As social creatures, we all sometimes do face work when we're interacting with others, but the internet allows us to do this in a way that life does not. because online we can edit our photos and the details of our lives to make ourselves look however we want. This might be one reason why, though people enjoy searching social media, we can also report that spending too much time on it can make us feel bad. Research data suggests that heavy users of social media platforms are more likely to suffer from symptoms of depression and anxiety. Why? There's probably more than just one reason. Remember, just because two things correlate doesn't mean one causes the other. There could be other factors at play, or the causal relationship might work in the other direction. People who are already depressed may just spend more time lying in bed surfing the internet, or they spend so much time online that they become socially isolated, which is in and of itself a major risk factor for depression. But some research suggests that surfing social media, even when the content is posted by our friends, can also cause us to just feel worse. Because the face work people do online can be more extreme. People filter or alter pictures to make themselves look more attractive, exaggerate or outright lie about how successful they are in their careers or how happy they are in their relationships. Constantly being exposed to other people who are exaggerating their success and happiness tends to make us feel worse about ourselves. This relates to the work of a social scientist named Leon Festinger, who observed, in the 1950s, that having an innate sense of social or personal worth is actually hard for many people. Most of us evaluate ourselves at least sometimes through comparisons with others. Am I smart? Am I attractive? Am I successful? Am I happy? These can be hard questions to answer without looking around at other people and making comparisons. Do you think that's true? How do you develop an innate sense of your self-worth without comparing yourself constantly to others? Continuing on with our discussion of social media and internet content, the fact that following others on social media makes many of us feel insecure about our own lives, our successes, and our bodies is probably a feature, not a bug. Because when we feel bad about ourselves, a lot of us become more vulnerable to hyperconsumerism. Remember how we talked about the fact that most media is a for-profit business? It has to make money to survive? People sometimes assume that content they don't have to pay to access, content hosted on sites like Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, or online search tools like Google, are just free. But of course they aren't. For social media platforms and other internet resources, this money is often made in several ways. The first is through ads. Companies pay money to YouTube or Google or Instagram to put ads for their products in front of users. These ads can be very precisely targeted because the site gathers information about the amount of time you spend on the site, what you look at and share while you're there, along with the demographic data you provide them when you sign up, such as your age, sex, etc., the location data from your device, and in some cases the info they get from analyzing your posted photos, statuses, and even your private messages. From all this, they can usually figure out what you like. Someone who spends a lot of time looking at makeup tutorials gets lots of ads for beauty products. Someone who likes sports content or follows professional athletes gets ads for team merchandise, and so on. Platforms like Instagram also often allow you to click on the ad to buy the product directly through them. The merchandiser gets a sale, and the platform can take a commission or a cut of that sale. This is an additional source of revenue. Influencers, streamers, and other content creators can leverage all of this to make their own money too, most commonly by being paid to sponsor or directly sell certain products. This post from Khloe Kardashian, featuring a selfie eating a gummy supplement and touting its benefits and making her hair healthier, may be an example, although in her defense, the post hashtag clearly notes that this is an ad. Not all content creators do that. Some also make money by taking a cut of ad revenue, marketing their own merchandise, books, or courses, or being incentivized via cash payouts from the platform for getting more subscribers. Some influencers and online content producers can make a lot of money doing this full time, in the same way that a very small minority of actors, athletes, or musicians can strike it big and make a lot of money. But the field is crowded, competition is intense, and the work is harder and more time-intensive than it looks. According to the Wall Street Journal in 2023, almost half of influencers, podcasters, and other internet content creators reported making $15,000 a year or less, which is low enough to put someone below the federal poverty line. Only 13% reported incomes of $100,000 or above, And even for this small percentage of seemingly successful ones, 100,000 might not go as far as it sounds in a high cost of living area like a major city. And also considering that they are self employed and usually have to pay out of pocket for things like health insurance. The more time you spend on social media platforms, the more money they can make from ads, sales, and collected data. So, sites like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, etc., want to grab your attention and hold it. They don't want you to put your phone down and go take a walk. They want to keep you scrolling. One way they can do this is by playing to certain strong emotions. People spend a lot of time looking at things that make us happy, cute videos of animals, for example. But people also tend to selectively pay attention to things that we find frightening and that make us angry. In traditional journalism, the slogan, "If it bleeds, it leads," describes the fact that news outlets devote a lot of coverage to scary stories about crime, diseases, and natural disasters, because things that scare us get our attention. From a survival perspective, this makes sense. Any animal instinctively wants to pay attention to a threat, and humans are no different. However, social media has learned to harness another strong emotion: rage. So-called rage bait content, stories about bad people doing bad things, both grab our attention and allow us to virtue signal by reposting the story and then forcefully denouncing it, reassuring ourselves and others that we are a better person because we would never do such an awful thing. A study conducted at Yale University in 2021 found that stories that allowed users to feel and express moral outrage tended to be rewarded with more likes and reposts. Some of these rage bait stories involved real events: corrupt politicians, street and white collar crime, abuse of vulnerable people or animals. But some, or even many, are exaggerated, intentionally misleading, or even completely made up. This can take us right back into the realm of conspiracy theories. It's also another social problem, because the more time we spend looking at content designed to make us hate and distrust other people, the more we may internalize these views. This might be one more reason why our society seems to be getting more polarized and divided. We're being fed a steady diet of stories designed to make us not trust each other or our social institutions. This takes us back to Alex Jones. Jones, shown here wearing tape over his mouth with "Protect the First Amendment" written on it as a protest during his trial, made a lot of claims on his shows, many of which, shall we say, can't be verified. He alleged that the government was creating extreme weather events like floods and tornadoes through the use of secret weather weapons, for example, and also that the government was deploying or developing chemical agents aimed at turning people gay so that they would stop having children. These claims got a lot of people to listen to and subscribe to Jones's content, and that helped the site make money. Like with many content creators, InfoWars' programming included pitches, ads, or testimonials for products viewers could buy directly through its online store, including diet supplements, health and wellness products, gun paraphernalia and accessories, and survivalist equipment. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Jones claimed on his show that some of his products, including a super silver whitening toothpaste and a super blue silver immune gargle, could stop or treat COVID-19, resulting in a cease and desist letter from the New York State Attorney General Letitia James. Jones also ran fundraising appeals, urging his audience to send him money so that he could continue his work uncovering the truth. This blend of moral outrage, fundraising, and merchandising allowed Jones and his company to amass money. While his financial statements in bankruptcy court listed his personal net worth at between $8.4 million or $9 million, a financial expert at one of Jones's trials in 2022 alleged that Jones and his company, Free Speech Systems, combined net worth was likely between $135 million and $270 million. What do you think? Was Alex Jones unfairly censored, or were the damages he had to pay justified? Also, what, if anything, do you do to verify that information you get on social media or the internet is accurate? How do you verify that the products you're being sold there are safe and effective? And finally, what, if any, responsibility do you think social media influencers or platforms like Instagram, YouTube, etc., should have to make sure they are not disseminating information that is inaccurate or harmful? On the last slide, I asked how you make sure the information you're getting is trustworthy. And that can be super hard. So, this is a quick comparison of where the information we consume might come from and the safeguards that exist to keep it trustworthy. In a college class, most of the data we present you to comes from academic research. And that is what you want, because academic researchers or scientists have to go through a process called peer review to get their work published in a scholarly journal. For example, a scientist hypothesizes that a form of talk therapy might help slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease. She gets a sample of 60 volunteers and assigns half to an experimental group who do the therapy, the other half, the control group, do not. She compares outcomes between both groups, as well as any potential side effects, and finds her hypothesis is supported. Yay! She submits her findings to an academic journal for publication, but before they will be published, they will undergo peer review. The editor of the journal sends the article to 3 other experts in the field of Alzheimer's therapy, and they review it carefully, looking for potential problems. Usually, they return with a long list of critiques and concerns that the researcher must address. They might notice mistakes that have to be fixed, or they demand she run different statistical tests, or even go back to the drawing board and do further experiments. She's got to address all those things before she can publish, and the whole process can take months or even years. And even once her study is published, good data need to survive replication. Ideally, other research teams will do similar studies to see if the researcher's findings hold up. Scientific research can be very slow for this reason, but the goal is absolute accuracy. A journalist doesn't have to go through all that to get a story published, in part because he must work on a tighter timeline. But he can't just make stuff up either. Mainstream news outlets, like the New York Times or CNN, for example, employ fact checkers and editors whose job it is to verify a journalist's claims to the best of their ability before running a story. They also have legal departments to protect the paper from the kind of lawsuits that could happen if they print false or defamatory information. If a story turns out to have errors, those outlets will usually publish retractions, statements that spell out what the paper or broadcast got wrong, maybe along with an apology. Journalists who are found to have falsified stories, it does sometimes happen, lose their jobs, and the media outlet has to do damage control or be subject to lawsuits, which it does not want. These systems are not perfect, and sometimes bad or misleading content still gets published. However, online content creators or influencers don't usually work under those same constraints, and they don't necessarily always have to tell you the truth. If you listen to the show carefully, you might hear a disclaimer, such as, "Views are my own," or "for entertainment purposes only," but some might not even do that. This can be a real problem in an era when an increasing number of people get their news in the form of reposts on social media platforms or from influencers or podcasters. This is an important thing to remember when you're consuming media. That influencer who swears the essential oil she's selling you will prevent you from getting cancer isn't undergoing peer review. And the podcaster who tells you that the government has a top secret technology that allows them to control your brainwaves by satellite, but is also conveniently selling you an aluminum foil hat he swears will block them for the low price of $99, might turn around and claim he's just an entertainer if he's challenged on it.
Paradoxically, at the same time that media can perform dysfunctionally by whipping up crises that don't really exist, it can sometimes do the opposite, creating what's called narcotizing dysfunction. This happens when viewers are bombarded with so many tragic and frightening stories, they eventually become fatigued and desensitized. They get burned out and lose the ability to care. News media love to cover tragedies, crimes, and new public health threats, because at first these things get us to tune in. If it bleeds, it leads, is the slogan in journalism. But over time, we can only pay attention to any one given threat for so long. Basically, we get overwhelmed and lose the ability to care. When that happens, media coverage leads to viewer inactivity rather than action or activism. This brings us back to the third in our big three sociological perspectives, conflict perspective. Again, conflict perspective argues two things. One, that human behavior is driven by struggles between groups over resources, and two, that privileged groups will structure social institutions to maintain their dominant position. How does a member of conflict perspective understand media? Well, from the perspective of a conflict theorist, Media is ideally suited to this, to structuring social institutions to maintain the dominant position of people who are already in charge, because it plays such a strong role in socializing us. Mass media, a conflict theorist would argue, does not function as a platform where diverse members of society can express multiple viewpoints. Rather, it is more likely to function as a means of expressing the dominant ideology, a set of cultural beliefs and practices that help to maintain powerful social, economic, and political interests. This is basically the point of view of the people in charge, according to the conflict theorist, and would tend to emphasize the message that the current way of things is the best one, and we should all just go along with it. It is true that mass media are produced by a very small segment of the population. These people tend to be relatively socially privileged, and they exert a great deal of control over what eventually reaches the audience, a phenomenon known as gatekeeping. Because of this, the biases and viewpoints of this particular group of producers, advertisers, publishing houses, and studio executives will ultimately tend to shape what goes on the air. Independent media is a little bit different. It is produced by a less influential, more diverse group of content creators, but it also doesn't have the same ability to reach the kind of large audiences that a Hollywood movie, for example, can, because it doesn't have the resources to market and distribute on that scale. So now, as in the past, most of the media that we consume is produced by a relatively small segment of the population, and one that doesn't necessarily reflect the diversity of the American or global public.
We see this even in news media, which is supposed to present us with the unbiased truth. Research on the portrayal of minorities in news media crime coverage, for example, show that minorities tend to be overrepresented as perpetrators in TV news crime coverage when compared to real-life arrest records, and also presented differently. An analysis of local news coverage in Nebraska, conducted in 2014, found that black people were portrayed as suspects or perpetrators in 69% of major crime stories, despite constituting only 31% of arrestees, whereas whites were portrayed as perpetrators or suspects in 31% of local news major crime stories, although whites made up 61% of arrestees in that market. National news media platforms in a later study were found to overrepresent black people as criminals by 11 percentage points and underrepresent whites as criminals by 39 percentage points, again when compared to arrest records. A 2021 study co-authored by the Equal Justice League and Global Strategy Group found that news stories about black defendants also portrayed them differently. They were more likely to use mugshots than those featuring white defendants, 45% to 9%, for example, and also more likely to show the accused wearing a prison jumpsuit compared to a suit and tie. When news media covered victims of crimes like murder, that same study found that white murder victims were 4 times more likely to be shown in photos surrounded by family members or friends, whereas black murder victims were more likely to be shown alone. White defendants were also more likely to be referred to by their names instead of by a label like the accused. And that could cut both ways, actually. Having your name printed when you're accused of a serious crime can serve to humanize you in the public's imagination, but it could also make it harder to rebuild your life if later, say, you're exonerated. As for why this happens, a Pew Research Center report found that about 76% of all reporting journalists surveyed indicated that they were white, compared to 8% indicating they were Hispanic and 6% indicating they were black, with 3% indicating they were Asian. 2023 data from Pew indicated that only about 12% of local TV news directors were black or Hispanic. So, although news is supposed to be objective, our perceptions of reality can be shaped by our backgrounds or experiences, and journalists, directors, and writers are no different. Critiques of media bias don't stop there. U.S. conservatives, for example, often accuse mainstream media outlets of having a liberal or left-leaning bias. And then some more left-leaning individuals turn and complain that no, these same outlets are clearly biased toward more conservative points of view. Again, I suppose to some extent this is hard to fix. People have biases and personal beliefs, and these tend to shape our perceptions, even of what we think is objective reality.
Viewing stereotyped images can influence our perceptions in other ways as well. Psychologists talk about something called confirmation bias, which describes the tendency to seek out and remember information that confirms our pre existing beliefs. This has to do with the way we process information cognitively. We are constantly bombarded with information, and our brains have to deal with all of it. Often, they take a shortcut by selectively noticing and remembering information that already confirms something we know to be true, or think we know to be true, and ignoring whatever contradicts it. When that happens, we call it confirmation bias. Sometimes our brains will even change or reinterpret information that contradicts something we believe to make it fit instead. In the 1970s, Cornell University psychologist Sandra Bem did a study where she showed small children pictures of little boys baking cookies and little girls boxing. She sent the kids home and then brought them back into her lab the next day and asked them what they'd looked at. All the children confidently reported that they'd seen pictures of little girls baking cookies and little boys boxing, even though they'd seen the opposite. The children's brains, already certain that little girls didn't box and little boys didn't bake cookies, just edited out what they'd seen so it fit with their stereotypes about gender. Adults do this too. If someone is prejudiced about members of a particular race, that person will immediately forget every instance when they saw a member of that race behaving well, and remember clearly every time they saw one behaving badly. People can change their biases, but since they will tend to initially ignore information that contradicts those biases, they generally need to be bombarded with a lot of counter-stereotypical information. They also need to have a basic willingness to engage with it. Media can either help with this process by presenting a more inclusive and non-stereotypical vision of the world, or it can hinder it by doing the opposite. Often, unfortunately, it does the second.
Since stereotypes tend to simply reinforce our biases, we tend to interpret them as proof that the stereotype is an accurate depiction of reality. Our biases can be challenged, but this generally requires a significant amount of contradictory information and also a conscious willingness on the part of the individual to engage with it. Biases can creep into media in ways that are quite subtle. Framing refers to the way issues are rhetorically packaged to encourage some interpretations of the issue and discourage others. How social problems are framed in reporting can heavily influence the way we think we come to understand them and the kinds of solutions that seem workable. For example, when media frame drug addiction as a crime issue, this might lead a viewer to assume that addiction should be addressed by imposing harsher penalties on dealers and users, building more prisons, or putting more police on the street. But what about when media talk about drug addiction as a disease or public health issue? That's a different frame, and suddenly, subconsciously, it suggests different solutions. You don't solve a disease by putting sick people in jail, after all. Sick people need hospitals or therapy. The facts haven't changed, but that difference in how they are presented, addicts are criminals versus addicts are sick people, can be really powerful.
Finally, and one important thing to always remember, is that while mass media may shape our vision of the social world, it doesn't control it. Audiences still ultimately determine what to make of the messages they consume. We call this tension the distinction between encoding and decoding. Encoding, according to social theorist Stuart Hall, refers to the intended meaning of a media text, and decoding refers to the process by which people actively and creatively interpret that text. All media consumption shows this process, and there are lots of examples. The writers, directors, and producers of a film may think they're making a horror movie, but audiences might decide to treat it as a comedy instead. Actually, 2014 horror film Zombievers was probably always supposed to be funny, but you get the idea. Movies and TV shows about war, like Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Saving Private Ryan, or even the long-running TV drama MASH, often originally set out with the intention of being anti-war and anti-military by trying to demonstrate just how brutal and senseless war is. But inevitably, some young audience members viewed them differently, interpreting the life and death struggles on screen as adventurous and heroic, and deciding to join the military themselves in search of their own war experiences. The encoded message, war is hell, was ultimately replaced by a totally different decoded one, war is exciting. This concludes our lecture on the sociology of media. Thank you for listening.